She was a barefoot ghost in a saloon, owned by debts she could never repay, until the night a giant cowboy walked in, dropped a pouch of gold, and declared, "You'll give me 5 sons and never work again." What followed was a tale of survival, love, betrayal, and redemption in the Wild West, one that will leave you breathless until the very end. The Silver Spur Saloon in Santa Fe was a place where the night never ended and daylight never quite belonged. Lanterns burned low, casting a sickly glow on stained floorboards that creaked beneath boots heavy with dust and secrets. The piano in the corner stumbled through another tune, each wrong note swallowed by the drone of voices and the rattle of poker chips. Men laughed too loud, drank too hard, and gambled away what little they had left. It was the kind of place where hope came to die, and where Clara Monroe had been slowly dying for years. She was barefoot, as always. The skin of her heels was hardened from countless nights spent gliding across splintered planks, carrying trays stacked with glasses that smelled of whiskey and desperation. Her movements were quiet, invisible, almost spectral. The men called her Ghost, half in jest, half in truth, because she could slip through a crowded room without leaving a trace. To most, she wasn't a woman, not even a person, but a shadow that existed to serve them, drink after drink, until her body finally gave out. Clara had long since stopped counting the years. She had been only 17 when Victor Grady, the saloon's owner, first offered her work. 5 years later, she had mastered the art of endurance, to smile when she did not want to serve when she had nothing left to give, to disappear inside herself while the world devoured her piece by piece. Grady kept her tied to the Silver Spur with debts scribbled in a ledger no one else was allowed to see. He charged her for meals, for the threadbare dress she wore, for the cot upstairs where she slept beneath a leaking roof. Even the water she used to wash was tallied against her name. The total never shrank. It only grew, like chains tightening each time she thought of escape. At night, when the saloon finally went quiet, Clara would slip to her room and reach for the tin box hidden beneath her mattress. Inside lay the only pieces of her past she had managed to keep: a tarnished locket with her mother's fading portrait, a torn page from the Bible her father once carried before gambling stripped him of everything, and a single hawk feather she had found on the trail west. She would hold them in her hands and imagine they were proof that she had once belonged to a different life, a different girl, one who might still be alive somewhere inside her. But in the Silver Spur, survival was mathematics. Serve drinks, endure touches, keep breathing. The customers never saw her. They saw only what they could take. Sheriff Dalton Briggs saw it most of all. He came twice a week, always drinking for free, always resting a hand too heavily on her shoulder when she passed. His badge was crooked, like everything else about him, but it gave him the authority to do as he pleased. Clara had tried running once. Briggs had been the one to drag her back, his deputies laughing as she stumbled behind them with blood on her feet. She had not tried again. That night the air was thick, hotter than usual, carrying the sour weight of sweat and spilled liquor. Clara moved between tables, tray balanced against her hip, eyes downcast. A ranch hand cursed as he lost a hand of cards, slamming his fist so hard the coins rattled. The piano player fumbled, started again, his trembling fingers struggling to keep rhythm. Clara kept her pace steady, invisible, the way she always had. And then the door opened. It was not the first time a stranger had entered the saloon, but it was the first time silence followed him in. Conversations faltered. Dice froze mid-roll. Even the piano stumbled into quiet as the old man's hands stilled on the keys. The figure that stepped inside seemed to bend the air around him. He had to duck to clear the doorway, his frame so broad his shoulders nearly brushed the lanterns hanging low from the beams. Elias McCord. His name rippled through the room in hushed tones. Some called him the Giant of Sierra Verde, some the Ghost of the War. He owned more land than any man in the county, 6,000 acres of fertile soil north of Santa Fe, and with it, more cattle than most men had ever seen. He had returned from battle with pockets heavy in gold and a silence heavier still. He did not look at the sheriff. He did not look at the card players or Victor Grady standing behind the bar with his rehearsed smile. His eyes, gray and unblinking, cut through the smoke and shadows until they found her. Clara froze. Her breath caught, her tray shook, whiskey trembling in its glasses. She was used to men staring, but not like this. His gaze was not hungry. It was not cruel. It was steady, sharp, as though he had been searching for her and had finally found what he was looking for. When he spoke, his voice rolled through the saloon like thunder across the desert. "You'll give me 5 sons and never work again." The words landed with the weight of prophecy. Not a question, not a request, a statement carved into the night like stone. For a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter, nervous and mocking, the sound of men who didn't understand and so tried to make light of it. One spat his beer, another slapped the table, hooting. But Elias did not laugh. His expression never shifted. Clara's tray tipped, whiskey spilling across her skirt, soaking into the fabric like a stain she would never wash out. Her chest tightened. Was this another cruel game? Another trap to humiliate her? Victor Grady stepped forward quickly, smile oily, his hand gesturing like a merchant about to make a sale. Now, Elias," he said smoothly. "The girl isn't exactly available for such arrangements. She owes me quite a bit, you see. Years of work left on her ledger." Elias reached into his coat, pulled free a leather pouch, and dropped it onto the bar. The coins clinked loudly, the sound of wealth enough to silence the laughter. "Her debt is paid," he said, voice low but carrying to every corner. He did not glance at Grady. He did not look at Sheriff Briggs, whose hand twitched near his holster. His eyes never left Clara's. "And whatever number you plan to invent next, it's paid too." The saloon seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff shifted, his jaw working as though grinding stone. Victor Grady's grin faltered, eyes calculating. Somewhere in the corner, a ranch hand muttered, "What's he want with used goods?" Loud enough for Clara to hear. Her face burned, her knees felt weak. For so long she had been invisible. For so long she had belonged to everyone and no one. And now this man, this giant she had never spoken to, was tearing her chains apart with 7 words. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to ask what he saw in her, why he would risk coin and conflict for a barefoot girl who had long since forgotten how to dream. But the words tangled in her throat, unspoken. Elias McCord stood before her like a force of nature, immovable, inevitable. And Clara Monroe realized, with a shiver that ran from the soles of her feet to the crown of her head, that her life was no longer her own. It had just begun. The dawn over Santa Fe rose with the color of embers, and Clara Monroe stood in the street with nothing but a bundle clutched tight to her chest. The silver spur still lingered behind her like a bad dream, its crooked sign swaying in the early wind, its shadows reluctant to release her. She didn't look back. If she did, she feared the town itself would pull her in again, drag her back into debts and darkness. Elias McCord waited by his wagon, the kind of wagon built not for show but for endurance, canvas stretched taut, wheels sturdy, the kind of machine that could cross both deserts and storms. He stepped forward, holding something wrapped in paper. She looked down, puzzled, until he placed it into her hands. When she opened it, she found a pair of boots. Plain leather, freshly stitched, smelling of oil and earth. Her eyes stung with something she didn't recognize at first. He watched her quietly, and when she hesitated to put them on, he said in a voice as steady as stone, "No one walks barefoot on my land." Clara slid them over her feet, awkward at first, the leather stiff against her skin. But as she stood taller, something shifted inside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't barefoot. For the first time in years, she felt a boundary between herself and the world that had so often cut her. The wagon jolted forward, and they left Santa Fe behind, the buildings shrinking into silhouettes against the rising sun. Silence filled the first stretch of road, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but alive with unsaid things. Clara studied Elias's profile as he held the reins. His jaw was cut like granite, his eyes scanning the horizon with the instinct of a man who had seen too much to ever truly rest. He didn't fidget, didn't fill the air with small talk the way men in the saloon had. He simply was, solid and vast, like the land itself. The desert opened around them, a cathedral of dust and sky. Red mesas rose like ancient altars, shadows stretching long across the earth. Clara had lived in Santa Fe for years but had never left its limits. She hadn't realized the land could be so wide, so unbroken, so unyielding. The silence pressed against her, and for the first time in a long time she didn't feel trapped by it. They stopped by a creek at midday, water glinting like glass under the sun. Clara knelt, cupping her hands to drink, and the coolness shocked her mouth. Elias tossed her a strip of dried venison, and she chewed it slowly, her body remembering hunger more than taste. She wanted to ask him so much, but her voice resisted. Finally, she whispered, "Why me?" The words slipped out before she could hold them back. He didn't look at her immediately. He stared across the water, jaw tightening as though weighing what to say. "Because you've survived," he said finally. "And survival is what keeps land alive." She didn't know what she expected. Romance, kindness, pity. But his words struck something, deeper. They weren't soft, but they were true. And truth had been a rare currency in her life. As the wagon rolled on, she began to speak, halting at first. She told him fragments of Missouri, where she was born, of her mother who sang hymns in the kitchen, of her father whose gambling debts sold her future before she even knew what it was worth. She didn't tell him everything, not the bruises, not the nights she'd cried into her pillow until the sound of her own voice scared her, but enough for him to know she hadn't always been a ghost. He spoke too, though sparingly, about the war, about men who didn't come home. "It's like carrying a saddlebag of ghosts," he said. "You ride with them wherever you go." Clara didn't flinch at the words. She understood. She carried her own ghosts, even if they had different names. By the third day, the land began to soften. Dust gave way to patches of green, valleys stitched with rivers, orchards rising in the distance. Clara leaned forward, her breath catching as she saw cattle moving across the hills like coins scattered across a table. And then, as the sun bled into the horizon, Sierra Verde Ranch appeared. The house rose from the land like it had always belonged there. 2 stories of timber and stone, porches wide enough for laughter to echo, windows glinting with the last fire of sunset. Barns stood sturdy, smoke drifted from a distant cookhouse, and a windmill turned slowly against the sky. Clara stared, her chest tight. It was not a palace, but to someone who had slept in rooms the size of closets, it might as well have been. She stepped down from the wagon, her boots crunching against the gravel, and felt impossibly small before its vastness. Elias led her inside, The house smelled of cedar, of wood smoke, of something warm she couldn't name. He stopped at a door on the second floor and pushed it open. Inside was a room that made her stop short. A bed with a quilt the colors of sunrise, curtains at the window, a dresser with a mirror attached, a wash basin on a stand. She stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. "This is yours," Elias said. "You can stay or you can go, but if you stay, what I said in town stands." She turned to him, but he was already walking away, his boots echoing down the hallway. Later, Mrs. Ortega, gray hair tied back, hands smelling of flour and herbs, knocked gently on her door. She brought food, eggs, beans, biscuits warm enough to steam. Clara ate carefully at first, waiting for someone to snatch it away, for a demand to follow. None came. That night, Clara lay on the quilt in her dress, curled against the wall as though the comfort might be a trap. The silence pressed around her, but it wasn't the silence of the Silver Spur. It was wide, like the desert, like the stars she could see glittering outside her window. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for footsteps on the stairs, for the slam of a door, for the lash of a voice. She closed her eyes, the taste of warmth still in her mouth, the feel of boots still heavy on her feet. And in that silence, Clara Monroe allowed herself something she had almost forgotten how to do. She dreamed. Clara Monroe woke each morning in Sierra Verde to a stillness she had never known, a silence so complete that she sometimes lay in bed waiting for the sharp voice of Victor Grady or the heavy tread of Sheriff Dalton Briggs on the saloon stairs. But there was no barked command here, no key turning in a lock, only the call of meadowlarks outside her window and the smell of cedar rising with the sun. It unsettled her at first, the absence of cruelty. A body accustomed to fear needed time to learn what it meant to be unafraid. She began to explore the house as though it might vanish if she looked too closely. Each room seemed built for a life she had never been meant to have. The parlor held shelves of books, their spines lined neatly as though waiting for hands to turn them. The dining room had a table long enough for 12, though only 2 places were ever set. In the upstairs hallway hung portraits of people Clara assumed were Elias's parents, faces strong and solemn, looking out at a future that had been cut short before it could unfold. Every step she took inside that house reminded her she had walked into a story she did not belong to, and yet one she could not help but become a part of. It was the piano that called to her most. It sat in the parlor under a film of dust, keys yellowed but intact. She passed it day after day before daring to touch it. When her fingers finally pressed one note, the sound was brittle and lonely, like something trapped too long in silence. But it awoke something inside her. She remembered her mother's hands guiding hers across church hymnals back in Missouri, remembered how the simplest melody could fill a room with light. Soon she returned to the piano each evening, pressing clumsy scales until the music returned. She was not good, but she did not have to be. The sound filled the hollows of the house, and more importantly, it filled the hollows inside her. Elias never asked her to play, but she noticed how he lingered in the doorway when she did, his massive frame leaning against the wood, his eyes fixed not on her hands but on her face. He spoke little, yet his presence carried weight. She could feel it when he sat at the far end of the dinner table, when he passed her a dish without a word, when his boots crossed the porch at dusk as she stood watching the stars. His silence did not press against her the way Grady's or Briggs's had. His silence made room for her. Clara's body began to change too. Months of meager meals at the Silver Spur had left her hollow, her skin stretched thin over bones. But under Mrs. Ortega's watch, food was always plentiful. Biscuits with butter, fresh eggs, stew thick with potatoes and meat. At first, she ate cautiously, afraid of taking too much, but gradually her hunger claimed what it needed. Her cheeks flushed with color, her shoulders straightened, and when she looked in the mirror above the dresser, she sometimes failed to recognize herself. She looked less like the ghost the saloon had named her, and more like the woman her mother might have wanted her to become. Still, Clara did not sit idle. She had spent too long being told her worth was only in what she could serve to others. Now she discovered the pleasure of choosing labor for herself. She asked Mrs. Ortega to teach her how to bake bread, and the older woman obliged, guiding her hands as she kneaded dough until her arms ached. She tended chickens, learning which needed gentleness and which needed firmness. She mended curtains, planted wildflowers near the porch. Each act was small, but each made her feel a little less like she was waiting for life to happen, and a little more like she was shaping it herself. But shadows are not easily left behind. One afternoon, Clara stood at the window and saw dust rising in the distance. Sheriff Dalton Briggs rode at the head of 2 deputies, papers clutched in his fat hand. The sight of him made her stomach twist. She backed away from the glass, heart hammering, but Elias was already stepping out onto the porch. "Got a warrant here," Briggs announced, voice carrying on the hot wind. "Girl stole from the Silver Spur. We're gonna search." Clara pressed her palm to the window frame, cold despite the heat outside. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Elias stood wide and still, the way an oak tree stands against a storm. "You step onto this land without my word," he said, his voice deep, even, unshaken. "You'd best be ready to pay with blood." The words landed heavy. The deputies shifted uneasily, their hands near their holsters but their eyes uncertain. Briggs's jaw clenched, his face turning red. He spat in the dirt but did not advance. "This ain't over, McCord. You've made enemies bringing her here. She'll bring you nothing but trouble." They turned their horses and rode away, but Clara could still feel the weight of Briggs's threat long after the dust had settled. She found Elias standing on the porch, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon, as though watching for a storm that hadn't yet broken. "Why?" she asked softly when she stepped outside. "Why protect me? You don't even know me." He turned his eyes toward her then, and for the first time, she saw not just the man, but the soldier, the weight of battles fought and lost etched into the lines of his face. "Because you've endured," he said, "and endurance is what this land needs most." She carried those words with her like a talisman. For years she had been told she was weak, a burden, a debt. But here was a man who saw her survival not as shame, but as strength, who valued not what had been taken from her but what she had managed to hold on to. It unsettled her, but it also rooted her in a way nothing else had. That evening, when she sat at the piano, she played with more confidence. The notes stumbled still, but they carried weight, filled the house with something living. Elias listened from the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor, silent but present. And when she finished, she did not lower her eyes. She looked at him directly, as if to say she was no longer a ghost, no longer invisible. For the first time, she felt the truth of it. She was alive. She belonged to no ledger, no saloon. She was Clara Monroe, and she was beginning to believe she might yet have a life worth living. Summer deepened across New Mexico, and the land around Sierra Verde swelled with color and sound. The grass grew high and green where the streams ran, wildflowers pushed their bright faces to the sun, and the cattle spread across the rolling hills like coins scattered across a gambler's table. In the mornings, Clara Monroe walked barefoot through the dew before remembering she had boots now, boots that lifted her above the ground instead of tying her to it. She had begun to move differently, shoulders back, head unbowed. She was no longer a shadow slipping between men's gazes. She was learning to exist in the full light of day. Elias McCord noticed the changes, though he never said much. He was not a man of easy words. His silences remained, but Clara no longer feared them. They were no longer walls that shut her out, but steady ground that gave her space to grow. At breakfast, he watched her pour coffee with a kind of quiet astonishment, as though he were trying to memorize every motion. She caught him once, his eyes lingering too long, and for the first time she did not look away. It was Elias who insisted she learn to ride. At first, Clara resisted, the memory of being dragged back into Santa Fe on horseback by Briggs's deputies still raw in her bones. But Elias led out a gentle mare, pale gray with soft eyes, and placed the reins in Clara's hands. His presence steadied her, and slowly she mounted, gripping the saddle with trembling fingers. He walked beside her at first, one hand on the bridle, but by the second week he let her ride alone. She laughed aloud when the wind tore through her hair, a laugh so strange to her own ears that it startled her. Elias, riding ahead, turned at the sound, and though he said nothing, the corner of his mouth curved in the barest ghost of a smile. Clara did more than ride. She began to share in the work of the ranch by choice, never from demand. During branding season she stood with the men, holding ropes taut, her arms aching but steady. She learned how to mend fences, how to coax stubborn calves to feed. The ranch hands at first looked at her with skepticism. She was the girl from the Silver Spur, the saloon ghost who had poured their whiskey. But as weeks passed, they saw her persistence, the grit that would not let her falter, and they began to nod at her with quiet respect. Sunday mornings, Elias took her into Santa Fe for church service. The first time, whispers rose behind her like snakes in the dust. Women hid their words behind gloved hands, eyes sharp with judgment. "Saloon trash," one murmured as she passed. Clara lifted her chin higher, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. She sat beside Elias in the pew, her shoulders squared, her voice steady as she joined the hymns. It was the first time she had sung since leaving Missouri, her voice rusty but true. When service ended, some turned their backs, but others, the shopkeeper's wife, a rancher's daughter, met her eyes and did not look away. That small defiance gave her more strength than any whispered insult could take. As the days stretched into cooler nights, the rhythm of life at Sierra Verde became something Clara looked forward to. She no longer ate like a starving girl. She no longer startled when a door opened or flinched when someone spoke her name. She began to feel the house itself embracing her. The wide porches where she stood to watch sunsets. The library where she traced her fingers over spines of books she could not yet read but wanted to. The piano that now carried more certain melodies each evening. Each corner of Sierra Verde carried her imprint now, as though the land had begun to recognize her as its own. And then there was the storm. The first storm of autumn came fierce, sweeping over the mountains with a violence that shook the ground. Clara had always feared storms. As a child, she had hidden beneath her mother's quilts, and in the Silver Spur she had lain awake, thunder rattling the roof, imagining the walls collapsing around her. That night at Sierra Verde, lightning split the sky, the windows rattled, and the cattle bellowed in the pastures. Clara left her bed and drifted down to the parlor where Elias sat with a lantern burning low. His presence filled the room like stone fills a canyon. She stood there trembling, the sound of rain hammering the roof like fists. He looked up, his eyes steady, and without hesitation she crossed the room and sat beside him. When thunder cracked, she flinched. His hand, large and rough, found hers. He held it gently, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. Clara's breath caught, and when she looked into his face she saw not demand, not possession, but a quiet offering. Their first kiss came then, soft and startling, a spark in the midst of the storm. After that night, something shifted between them. They did not speak of it openly, but their silences grew warmer, their glances lingered longer. At dinner, Clara once reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He froze for a heartbeat, then let his fingers close around hers, engulfing her hand completely. They sat that way, saying nothing, but the air between them had changed. Whispers from Santa Fe still reached them. Sheriff Dalton Briggs had not forgotten his humiliation at Sierra Verde. He whispered in taverns, speaking of land surveys, of north fields that rightfully belonged to Victor Grady. He found willing ears among those who resented Elias's wealth, and his threats crept like weeds. Clara overheard talk of him one evening as Elias and Hank, his foreman, spoke low on the porch. She knew danger lingered on the horizon, but for the first time, fear did not consume her. She was no longer alone, no longer a ghost. One evening, as the sun bled into shades of amber and rose, Clara found Elias sitting on the porch, his massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. She walked to him without hesitation. No words were needed. She took his hand, steady and warm, and led him inside, up the stairs, into the room that had once felt too grand for her to touch. The silence of Sierra Verde was different that night, not absence, but promise. Clara Monroe, who had been caged for so long, had chosen freely, and in that choice lay a power stronger than any storm. Winter settled early across Sierra Verde. Frost etched lacework on the windows, and smoke curled from the chimneys into pale skies. Inside the ranch house, warmth gathered in the hearth, the firelight flickering against walls that once felt cavernous, but now pulsed with a quiet expectancy. Clara Monroe had grown rounder in her face, her steps slower, her body softer, carrying a secret she had known for weeks before she finally spoke it aloud. One evening, she sat with Elias McCord before the fire, a quilt draped over their knees. The flames threw shifting light across his features, hard and rugged, yet softened by the stillness of the hour. She took a breath, steady though her heart raced. "I'm carrying your child," she said, "your first son." The words hung heavy in the air, as though the room itself had paused to listen. For a long moment Elias did not move, his eyes fixed on the flames. Clara feared she had made a mistake, that her confession would crack the fragile peace they had built. But then he turned to her, and in his face she saw not shock or pride, but something deeper, a reverence so profound it nearly broke her. Slowly, he slid from the chair to his knees, bent his head, and pressed his forehead gently against her stomach, though it showed no outward sign of change yet. His massive hands, hands that could build fences or break a man's jaw, rested with infinite gentleness on her sides. Clara felt her eyes burn with tears she could not hold back. From that moment the house itself seemed to change. It no longer felt like a monument to absence, like a home built for children who never came. It breathed differently, as though walls and windows understood that laughter would one day echo within them. Mrs. Ortega began sewing tiny garments in secret, smiling knowingly when Clara caught her. Hank, the foreman, worked the land with renewed vigor, often telling Elias that fences had to be made stronger, barns better, because little ones would soon be running across the yard. Yet beyond Sierra Verde, the world was not at peace. Sheriff Dalton Briggs had not been defeated, only delayed. Nursing his humiliation, he struck one final blow. Word spread that he had filed claims in Santa Fe, declaring that part of Sierra Verde's north fields rightfully belonged to Victor Grady. It was an old trick, tampering with survey records, twisting law into a weapon, but it carried enough weight to bring Elias to the courthouse. Clara, though heavy with fatigue, insisted on traveling with him. The courthouse was packed, its benches filled with townsfolk divided in whispers. Some came out of loyalty to Elias, others drawn by the lure of scandal. Briggs stood smug at the front, sweat slick on his collar. His badge still crooked, though it gleamed in the lamplight. Beside him, Grady smirked as if he had already won. The judge listened as Briggs laid out his claims, brandishing maps and records marked with falsified signatures. For a while, it seemed the weight of paper might outweigh the truth of the land itself. Clara sat stiff-backed beside Elias, her hand clutching his, fighting the urge to cry out. She remembered too well the crooked power of Briggs, the way he bent rules until they strangled those too weak to fight. But Elias had not come unprepared. When his turn came, he did not bluster. He stood calm and immovable, his voice steady as he laid out his case. And then, one by one, men and women from Santa Fe and beyond stood to speak. A rancher testified that Briggs had taken bribes to overlook grazing disputes. A blacksmith's wife produced letters proving Grady had schemed with the sheriff to falsify claims. Even the piano player from the Silver Spur, trembling with age, shuffled forward to tell of nights when Briggs and Grady had boasted of owning the town through fear. The room shifted. Whispers turned into nods. Briggs's smugness melted into sweat and rage. The judge, weary of the sheriff's long shadow over the county, struck down the claims with finality. In that moment, Briggs's power evaporated. His badge was stripped, his title erased, and he stormed from the courthouse to jeers from the gallery. Grady's face fell gray as stone. Without Briggs, his empire of debts and fear collapsed like a saloon table kicked from beneath it. Clara breathed for the first time in what felt like years. She had watched men like Briggs and Grady decide her life since she was a girl. To see them undone by truth, by the courage of voices once too afraid to speak, was a freedom she had never imagined she would live to witness. When Elias and Clara returned to Sierra Verde that evening, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in colors of fire. They stood on the porch together, the land stretching vast and unbroken before them. Clara rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly. Elias stood beside her, his arm draped over her shoulders, his gaze scanning the horizon with the same vigilance he always carried. But now there was peace in his eyes, too. "You said 5 sons," Clara teased softly, her smile shy but warm. Elias looked down at her, his gray eyes holding hers. A rare chuckle rumbled in his chest, low and deep. 5 sons, 5 daughters, 5 dreams. It doesn't matter. What matters is you'll never work to survive again, only to live. The words settled over her like a vow, not of possession, but of partnership. For Clara, who had lived too long as a shadow, it was the clearest light she had ever known. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered across the land, Clara lay awake beside Elias and thought of the journey that had brought her here. From the barefoot girl counting splinters in a saloon floor, to the woman standing at the heart of a ranch with a future growing inside her, she had traveled farther than miles could measure. She had crossed the distance between despair and hope, between invisibility and belonging. Outside, the stars stretched, infinite across the desert sky, the same stars she had once counted through a too-small window above the Silver Spur. Then, they had been coins she could never reach, reminders of what was denied her. Now they were lanterns, lighting the path for the life she carried, for the laughter that would one day echo in Sierra Verde's halls. The land was still vast, still harsh, still untamed. But for the first time, Clara Monroe felt it was not an enemy to endure, but a legacy to share. And in that realization, in the quiet weight of Elias's arm across her, in the steady promise of a child within her, she knew she had not only survived. She had begun to truly live. Clara Monroe's story is not a simple tale of a woman rescued by a man, nor merely a Western fable of dust, whiskey, and guns. It is, at its core, a story of endurance, rebirth, and the courage it takes to step beyond the shadows of pain into the light of possibility. To truly understand her journey, we must retrace her path from the beginning to its culmination at Sierra Verde, where a legacy of hope was finally born. For years, Clara was a ghost. At the Silver Spur Saloon in Santa Fe, she lived as an invisible shadow, barefoot and bound to debts she could never escape. Victor Grady owned her life on paper, while Sheriff Dalton Briggs ensured she could never slip free of his reach. Each night, she counted splinters beneath her feet and whispers behind her back, surviving on scraps of food and scraps of dignity. To the men who pawed at her as she passed with trays of whiskey, she was nothing more than saloon trash, a body to be bought and sold. And yet, in her invisibility, Clara carried a strength no one recognized, the ability to endure, to survive day after day when everything around her sought to erase her. It was endurance that Elias McCord saw when he entered the saloon that night. A giant of a man, scarred by war, burdened by solitude, he stepped into the Silver Spur and spoke words that silenced the room. "You'll give me 5 sons and never work again." It was not a question, not a proposition, but a statement as solid as the land he owned. In that moment, Clara's life was torn from the ledger that bound her and placed into a future she had never dared to imagine. Elias paid her debts with a pouch of gold, but what he truly offered her was something far rarer: freedom. Their journey to Sierra Verde was more than a wagon ride across the desert. It was a passage between 2 worlds. Clara left behind the dust of Santa Fe with nothing but a bundle of keepsakes and the leather boots Elias placed in her hands. "No one walks barefoot on my land," he told her, and those boots became the first step toward dignity, a barrier between her and a world that had scarred her too long. The silence of the open desert gave her space to breathe, to dream, and to speak fragments of a past she had long buried. And when Sierra Verde rose before her, sprawling and vast, Clara felt the weight of possibility pressing against her chest, like sunlight too bright to look at directly. Life at Sierra Verde was not immediate freedom, but a slow relearning of what it meant to live. The house that once echoed with emptiness began to fill with her presence. She played the piano in the parlor, awkward at first, then more confidently, as if reclaiming a piece of her mother's love through the halting melodies. She baked bread under Mrs. Ortega's guidance, planted flowers that pushed stubbornly through the dry soil, and began to take up space in a way she never had before. And in Elias's silence, she found not oppression, but room to breathe. He did not demand or dictate. He simply stood beside her, steady as the land itself, but shadows lingered. Sheriff Briggs, furious at being defied, brought deputies and false claims of theft to Sierra Verde's gates. Elias faced him with calm ferocity. "You step onto this land without my word, you'd best be ready to pay with blood." The sheriff retreated, but his threats lingered like storm clouds. Clara, watching from the window, asked Elias why he defended her. His answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. "Because you've endured. And endurance is what this land needs most." For the first time, she began to see herself not as a broken remnant, but as a foundation strong enough to build upon. Seasons turned, and with them came growth. Clara never believed possible. She rode horses for the first time, laughed when the wind tore her hair loose, and learned the satisfaction of work chosen freely rather than forced upon her. She held Elias's hand across the dinner table, kissed him during a thunderstorm, and eventually chose him wholly, stepping into his world not as property, but as partner. When whispers in town tried to drag her back into the shadow of the silver spur, she lifted her chin and walked taller. She was no longer the barefoot ghost. She was the woman of Sierra Verde. The true test came when Briggs and Grady tried once more to claim what was not theirs, twisting law and paper to seize Elias's land. Clara traveled to Santa Fe with him, heavy with the knowledge of the life growing inside her. In the courthouse, as voices rose against corruption, she watched the sheriff stripped of his power, saw Grady's empire collapse into dust. It was not violence that won that day, but truth, carried by people who had found the courage to speak at last. For Clara, it was more than victory, it was vindication. And then, in the quiet of Sierra Verde, came the moment that redefined everything. "I'm carrying your child," she told Elias. His response was not the pride of a man claiming property, but the humility of one recognizing a miracle. He knelt before her, forehead pressed to her belly, as though bowing before the future itself. The house, once silent and empty, now pulsed with anticipation, with the promise of laughter, footsteps, and life. Clara Monroe's journey is a story of the American frontier, but its truth extends beyond time and place. It tells us that survival is not weakness but strength, that endurance is not failure but proof of resilience. It shows us that freedom is not only the absence of chains, but the courage to step into a life we believe we are unworthy of and claim it anyway. For us today, Clara's story is a mirror. Many of us walk through life burdened by debts of the past, mistakes, failures, losses that weigh on us like ledgers we can never repay. We learn to make ourselves invisible, to survive rather than live. But Clara reminds us that endurance is not the end of the story. Endurance is the foundation. From it, we can rebuild, step by step, until we find a place where laughter and love are possible again. Perhaps we do not all have an Elias McCord to step through the saloon doors of our lives, but we all have within us the same strength Clara carried, the ability to endure, to take the next step, to plant flowers in barren soil. And when we claim that strength, when we allow ourselves to dream beyond survival, we create legacies that stretch beyond us. Whether 5 sons, 5 daughters, or simply 5 dreams, what matters is not what we produce, but how we choose to live. So let Clara Monroe's story stay with you. Let it remind you that no matter how invisible you have felt, no matter how many chains have held you, you are not defined by the saloon that sought to break you. You are defined by the endurance that carried you through it, and by the courage to step into a future where you are more than a ghost. You are alive, whole, and free. If this story moved you, if Clara's journey stirred something inside you, then I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, join our growing community, and help us continue telling stories of the Wild West. Stories of grit, resilience, and redemption that reach across time to remind us of our own strength. Your support gives us the fire to keep going, to keep unearthing these powerful tales. So click that button, stand with us, and let's walk together into the next story waiting just beyond the horizon.